The death of Tupac remained a huge mystery for decades, and technically, the case is still unsolved. It's not like anyone was actually convicted of the murder. So who is Keefe D, and what part did he play in the demise of one of the greatest, if not the greatest, rappers of all time? In his 2019 book, Compton Street Legend, Keefe D reveals the part he played in Tupac's killing, and that he does feel remorse. Although not a celebrity or rapper himself, Keefe D was connected to many key players in the 90s hip-hop era. He said he was there in the beginning of Death Row Records, friends with Suge Knight from middle school. He helped him get his label up and running. He also helped Puffy and Biggie Smalls navigate their affairs in the LA area, where they were nervous to frequent at times. Compton. Keefe D was born and raised in Compton, California. He is from the same era as legendary Straight Outta Compton rappers NWA, and he was friends with Eazy-E. Keefe D is the uncle of Orlando Anderson, the man believed to have been behind the killing of Tupac Shakur. He was caught on CCTV fighting with Tupac and Suge in the lobby of the MGM Grand on the night of the shooting. Suge, Tupac, and other members of Death Row jumped him and was seen on camera kicking him repeatedly. Keefe D, born Dwayne Keefe Davis, was born in 1963. He grew up with his mother, who was a stay-at-home mum, and his father, who was a Marine and a strong disciplinarian. Keefe is one of 12 siblings. Sadly, 2 of his brothers passed away, one from leukemia and the other was fatally shot. In the 60s and 70s, Compton was an affluent area that used to be predominantly white. Keefe D's father was hardworking and strived to provide a good life for his family. They still struggled until his father had a financial windfall at the races one day. He bet on 6 winning horses and won $50,000. This was like winning $1 million in those days, and the family became set for life. You could buy a house for $13,000 back then. He moved his family to the affluent Compton area in the 70s, along with other middle-class black families. In the height of racism in America, with segregation and a lack of civil rights laws for blacks, many white families didn't want to live in close proximity to black Americans. They packed up and left as a result. Compton was originally known for its farming community, believe it or not. In 1988, rap group NWA put Compton in the spotlight. With the release of Straight Outta Compton, they chronicled their lives on the streets of Compton, which was filled with violence and run-ins with the cops. This was portrayed in their epic biopic of the same name. Compton is one of the oldest cities in the Los Angeles County. It used to be a quiet, predominantly white suburb. The Bush family even lived there at one point. In the 40s and 50s, white gangs terrorized blacks and Latinos. The Spook Hunters, for example, was founded in reaction to the growing African American population in Los Angeles. They fought against integration, preferring that segregation continued. They would go on violent rampages across town, intimidating black youths. As a result, young black kids formed gangs to protect themselves and to fight back. But the well-known criminal gangs of today would not be formed until the early 70s. Southside Crips started in 1971 and were first known as the Us Boys. Keefe's first run-in with the Crips was at the age of 9. Crips would steal his bike, run him and his friends out of the local Compton College pool, and generally intimidate the younger kids. They would beef with the Pyrus, aka Bloods. The Us Boys and Crips joined forces as a result. They would play dice on the streets to pass the time. Once Keefe's dad pulled him off the streets while hanging out with Crips, not knowing that day he had just become one. He was just 9 years old when he became a Crip, along with 3 of his older brothers. Yes, just 9 years old. It was a sense of protection and having each other's back that may have drawn these young boys to these gangs. Suge Knight. Keefe and Suge played football in school at 11 and 12 years old. Keefe was a running back and Suge was a centre on the offensive line. Suge's cousins, Ronald and Donald, were also on the team. Ronald and Donald were the only boys on the team who were not gang members. Let that sink in. Suge Sr. was the team's coach. He owned a diesel truck company and the family were doing pretty well. After football, everyone would go back to Suge's house for some food and to swim in their pool. Keffe went to Emerson Elementary and was a straight A student. In 10th grade, he joined the UCLA Upward Bound program designed to help young people graduate from high school and college. He was one of their top students. The teachers had no reason to believe Keffe had nothing but a bright future ahead of him. He said himself that he could have been anything he wanted to. Instead, he chose to get deeper and deeper into gang life. He would stay at UCLA for 9 weeks during the summer and go there for weekends during the school year. It was an opportunity to get a feel for college life, get ahead academically, and most importantly, spend some time away from bad influences. As well as that, Keffe would receive $285 every Friday as part of the summer program. Most teenagers would consider this a lot of money. However, he soon learned that this money was peanuts compared to what his fellow gang members were earning. When he would go back to Compton, he saw that some of his friends were making more than $285 a day, so he decided to get into the drug game himself. At just 16 years old, his first job was to deliver a small package for his brother, and the rest is history. He would go on to become one of the wealthiest dealers in Compton and soon have an empire of his own. But at what cost? He got his first prison stint at the age of 20 from 1985 to 89. Prison did far from rehabilitate him. He became even more of a hardened gangster while there. He saw riots break out between Crips and Cubans. He even tried to stab an inmate because they disrespected a fellow Crip. He spent 64 days in solitary confinement as a result. He was tested every day by other Crip members while there, and he earned their respect. When he got out, Keffe went around the US trading drugs. He said each new town he went to, he made new Crip members, being careful not to interfere with existing turfs. He said interfering with different turfs and even talking to different women in these areas could get someone killed. He was married and chose to avoid that. At the time, different rappers were making their mark, talking about this life in their music. This would infuriate Keffe because he felt that they were talking about something they were not a part of. And these songs were a form of snitching. In one song, Jeezy said, "The bigger the rims, the bigger the birds," revealing what they would hide in the rims. Keffe was able to make a lot of money relatively quickly. The draw was too much to resist. Decades later though, he would say that it just wasn't worth it. There were so many lives ruined by spending more time in jail than free. So many senseless killings, including that of Tupac Shakur. What happens in Vegas? On September the 7th, 1996, Keffe was informed that his nephew, Orlando Anderson, had been jumped by some Death Row Record guys in the lobby of the MGM Grand. He and his crew rushed to where he was. They all agreed that they needed to address this with Suge immediately. Club 662 was where Suge was going to be, so they made their way there. They were in Vegas to watch the fight and kick it for the weekend. But after Orlando was jumped, that all changed. It got personal, he said. They waited in the parking lot of the club for what felt like an eternity. They decided to put their plan on hold and carry on with their festivities. By chance, they happened to cross paths with Tupac and Suge while on the way to another club. This set the course of events that would change the world of hip-hop forever, most tragically, ending the life of Tupac Shakur. Keffe said he looked Suge straight in the eye and he had a terrified look on his face. 25 years later, they would be the only two living witnesses to what went on that night. Puffy. Keffe was introduced to Puffy in 91-92 through a mutual friend. He went to a party in the El Rey Theatre. There he met Busta Rhymes as well as other celebrities and artists, and he was introduced to Puffy, who at the time was still relatively new and just trying to get his career off the ground. He didn't have anywhere near the level of money and success that he has today. Keffe insists that this is the moment his life went downhill and spiraled out of control. He wished he had never met him. A few months after they met, Puffy contacted Keefe to see if he could rent a 64 lowrider from him. Keefe would often rent cars to managers of music stars. The music video the car was needed for was Usher's song, Can You Get With It? Usher danced on the car and messed up the paint, so Puffy had to pay for the repairs. He later saw Puffy at the Beat Summer Jam show. Faith, Biggie, 112, Junior Mafia, Naughty by Nature, Jodeci, Mary J. Blige, and a whole bad boy crew were performing. O.J. Simpson's daughter was even there. According to Keefe, drugs were rampant at those parties. Although he was a big-time dealer, he only stuck to weed and booze. He said Biggie brought the house down with One More Chance. Suge was also in attendance. Keefe believes Suge was getting jealous that Bad Boy had a huge hit at the time with One More Chance. Suge wanted Death Row to have the same, a huge hit and a new up-and-coming star. Suge asked Keefe how he knew Puffy, and perhaps that's when the rivalry began. But what really caused tension between the two labels was when Suge made his infamous speech at the 1995 Source Awards. Suge made the controversial statement about producers being all up in the videos, clearly referring to Puffy. Come to Death Row, he said.
Any artists out there want to be an artist and want to stay a star, don't want to have to worry about the executive producer trying to be all in the videos, all on the record, dancing. Come to Death Row.
Members of the crowd began to boo, and Snoop, being young and easily riled up, started to get involved.
East Coast ain't got no love for Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg and Death Row. Y'all don't love us.
According to Keefe, it was members of the Wu-Tang Clan who started to boo first, but Suge decided to ignore them and pick on members of Junior Mafia instead. Keefe said Puffy approached him once outside a deli sandwich shop. He looked scared and asked him for a favour. He asked him to take care of Suge and Tupac. Keefe said, quote, "That's not a problem. We can make that happen," end quote. Keefe assumed that they would probably get $1 million. Everyone knew at the time that Puffy was a big record executive and managed huge stars in the hip-hop and R&B world. In the summer of 1996, Tupac's Hit 'Em Up was a huge topic on the streets. Keefe's crew thought they had been inadvertently addressed on the track, as Tupac said, "F anyone who is down with Bad Boy." Although there weren't any names mentioned, it was considered a diss against the Southside. Keefe and Tupac first met in 1989 when Digital Underground were performing with Public Enemy. Parliament Funkadelic and similar groups were huge at the time, incorporating funk and hip-hop. These groups would put on elaborate shows with crazy costumes and bizarre concepts. Going to these concerts would feel like a weird psychedelic experience. Digital Underground were influenced by this era and had a comical theme to their music, as well as dance and various costumes. Part of their act involved grown men wearing diapers. Keefe was taken aback when he first met Tupac because he was in a costume wearing a diaper. They all laughed and were pretty cool with each other. According to the book, they met again at a star-studded house party. Queen Latifah, Jada, Will, Letitia and Dwayne Martin were also there, and Puffy and Tupac showed up to the party together. Keefe left early because he wasn't feeling the vibe. Then, he and Tupac bumped into each other during the California Love era, after he posted bail and signed to Death Row. This was the last time they saw each other before Vegas. There was a line in California Love that upset some of the Southside Crips, just like the other songs from rappers who weren't really about that life. Worldwide let them recognise from Long Beach to Rosecrans. On one occasion at the House of Blues on Sunset, Keefe was there with some Southsiders. They ran into Tupac and Big Syke from the Outlaws. One guy named Oldie allegedly grabbed Tupac by the collar and said, "Do you know what Long Beach to Rosecrans stands for?" Big Syke spoke for Tupac and said, "Nah homie, he's just rapping on a song. He don't know what's going on out here." Oldie warned Tupac that was some blood Pyru affiliation and he better ease up on that sort of thing. According to Keefe, that was the very moment Tupac had his chance to learn and not get involved in any gang beef. He should have learned his lesson then, he said. He believed Tupac had a full sense of security. He mistakenly thought Suge and Death Row crew would protect him. He assumed Suge was a huge player in that world, but that was not the case. Suge was in the music world, not in the gang world. Tupac thought Death Row was untouchable. The world Keffe was in was real life, not just music. The next time they saw each other was in Vegas. Death Row. Keffe was instrumental in getting Death Row started. It all began when he was asked to visit a friend in jail. He was reluctant to go because he himself was on parole. One dodgy conversation could land him back in jail if he wasn't careful. He decided to go and visit who he refers to as Boss Man, real name Michael Harris, also known as Harry O. Boss Man was serving 40 years for attempted murder and drug trafficking. He told Keffe there were 300 kilos worth of products that the police didn't get. Keffe knew where this was heading, but what surprised him is that Boss Man wanted to use the money from the proceeds to start his own record label. He even wanted Keffe to be the head of that label. Keffe knew how to shift drugs, but he didn't know how to run no record company. So he said no to the latter, and actually thought it was a terrible idea, but he decided to help with the rest. The money to start Death Row Records came from street guys. If it wasn't for Keffe, there would have been no Death Row. Boss Man was able to start the label with Suge. Suge knew Boss Man from back in the hood, and they used to do business together, so he was able to get on board with co-founding the company. Suge wanted Eazy-E to be part of the Death Row family, but he decided to decline and stay with his own label. Keffe found Dr. Dre's number for Suge, and Suge managed to convince Dre to join Death Row. Deep Cover was the first song released from Death Row Records. The song blew up, and the label went on to generate hundreds of millions of dollars.
About everybody rap. We don't rap. We rap to make money. We do business. Ain't no other record company out there that sold as many records as we did. We outsold Bad Boy, LaFaze, every black record label out there, we outsold them in 1 year. They don't even want to buy our record, but they gotta buy our record because we represent the street.
Boss Man would spend decades in jail. However, this year, 2021, he was one of the high-profile prisoners to receive a pardon from Trump after being denied parole multiple times. He is now out, and ironically, Suge is now doing time. When Michael Boss Man Harris was doing time, he would keep himself busy and manage Death Row from afar. There was a phone in the studio with a line dedicated to his calls. Suge was so serious about keeping this line open. Once he told some members of staff to get off the phone, and they refused to get off straight away. Allegedly, he arranged for them to be beaten up to teach them a lesson. Boss Man was also known for reviving the defunct San Quentin prison newspaper, and he taught other inmates how to start and manage businesses. He really showed signs of being rehabilitated, and the White House said that his time in prison was exemplary. Upon release, he said, "The fact that I'm out of jail and I got a chance to help my people. If I got to go back to the past and talk about the past so that it's never repeated on no level, I will do it until my dying days. The government is not going to be able to fix this country by itself. It's going to need business, community leaders, and people like me," he said. Despite Death Row being successful, Suge, for some reason, decided to become a blood. Dre ended up leaving because Suge was beefing too much. Something that confounds Keffe about many of today's rappers is that they make money in the rap game, become famous, then decide that they want to become gang members. Keffe and Suge were cool. Back then, Suge was a college student, not a gang member. They would run into each other throughout the years and hang out at various parties or events. One of the times he saw Suge, who was with Tupac and Snoop, outside the Peninsula Club on Sunset Boulevard. There were different Crips there. Suge, Tupac and Snoop rolled up in different Rolls Royces. Suge was in a red one, which matched his outfit, and his red Godfather hat. Snoop was in a black one, and Tupac was driving a white Rolls Royce. Keffe was behind Tupac's car. They all made their way to Club Paradise, a club that would be considered pretty ratchet today. Suddenly, Suge's car got shot up. His Godfather hat was laying in the street. Keffe assumed he was dead. Miraculously, he was unharmed. Keffe believes Suge probably thought that he and his crew had something to do with it, but that wasn't the case. Even so, maybe that was the moment things went downhill between him and Suge. According to Keefe, one thing about Southside Crips is that when one of their own makes it out of the hood, they support them and are genuinely happy for them. One guy named Victor was a football star at Dominguez High School. He got a football scholarship to play for a school in Arizona. We were all very proud to see one of our own make it on that level and get out of the hood, he said. They decided to hook him up with some clothes to ensure he was the flyest on campus. Victor was told to meet Keefe and some other Southsiders at the Lakewood Mall for school shopping. While he was there, he ran into 3 Piru gang members who were affiliated with Death Row. They started roughing him up a little and tried to intimidate him, something that was typical when rival gang members ran into each other. Right as this was going on, 5 Southsiders came through the mall doors. So Victor got cocky, punched one of the guys and grabbed his Death Row chain. An altercation ensued and the Piru members were beaten. One was even knocked out. The Southsiders headed out of there, postponing the shopping spree. They never thought anything of it after that. They left feeling victorious and having the upper hand. It was a typical day, but this incident will come back to bite in a big way and lead to a tragedy that would never be forgotten. What you put out there as a gang member always eventually comes back. A few weeks after this incident, Keefe and his crew began planning a trip to Vegas to see one of the greatest boxers of all time. Living in Southern California, it was nothing to jump in the car and drive out to Vegas for various sporting events. It wasn't a time to engage in their risky endeavours. It really was simply considered a time for kicking back with the homies and having fun. They knew Suge was going to be there, but they didn't think anything of it. Suge and Death Row were never considered to be on their level. They were industry dudes, not street dudes. They stopped to stock up on drinks and drove there with some other cars. Keefe said Foxy Brown was in one car. The whole group cruised to Vegas listening to classic R&B. Real gangsters aren't into gangster rap. Instead, they had Luther Vandross, Chaka Khan and Anita Baker blurring out along the way. At 5 p.m, they were at the Caesars Palace Casino and Resort. They also booked some rooms at the Carriage House for partying and kicking back for the weekend's festivities. The men were gambling and drinking while the women shopped and sat by the pool. Orlando Anderson, Keefe D's nephew, arrived on Friday. Orlando Anderson, also known as Baby Lane, was 6'3" with an athletic build. Keefe described him as a good dude with a big heart, someone who would give the shirt off their back to anybody in need. He loved life. They all stayed at the same hotel, using 3 floors and 18 rooms in the Caesar Palace. Keefe and Baby Lane went to the Versace store and bought suits. Contrary to what people believe, they didn't go around with their pants sagging. Keefe said, quote, "When a gangbanger becomes a gangster, you pull up your pants," end quote. Instead, they wore suits and $2,500 cashmere overcoats. On fight night, Keefe was sitting in the second row, not far from the numerous celebrities who were there. Tyson knocked out Bruce Seldon in the first round, typical. 20 seconds later, it was over. The group seats were spread out throughout the arena as they were purchased from a friend. So they decided to meet at the cafe inside the MGM. They waited for 15 minutes. Everyone started to show except for Baby Lane. Some 118 East Coast Crips came to inform them that some Death Row people jumped Baby Lane down by the casino. Remember the guy who had his chain snatched at the Lakewood Mall while fighting with Victor and other Southsiders? Well, he was walking with Tupac when leaving the MGM. He saw Baby Lane and identified him as the one who snatched his chain. That was it. Tupac went straight for him. Suge and the others soon followed. Keefe and the others rushed to find Baby Lane, just a few minutes after he had been jumped. Suge, Park and their crew had already left. His shoulder was messed up, but other than that he was okay. The whole incident was more humiliating than anything, especially as it was caught on CCTV and eventually replayed over and over again to the world. Some of the East Coast Crips offered to accompany Keefe as he and his crew went to look for Suge and them, but Keefe declined their offer and said that this was something that the Southside Crips had to deal with. They couldn't let some record execs punk them like that, or something to that effect. Plus, remember Puffy had already asked them to sort out Suge and Park. There was even speculated to be a $1 million bounty for the job. So there was even more of an incentive to retaliate. Keefe couldn't believe that someone who he had helped set up in the record business would turn around and harm his cousin and disrespect his family and crew like that. Last time he saw Suge, they were cool and hanging out together. He had no ill will towards him. Until now. The $1 million bounty rumours was business, but jumping his nephew was personal. The guy who was with Foxy Brown that night was called Zip. He came over and asked Keefe to get into his car. From a secret compartment, he handed him a Glock, which he put in his back pocket. He got out and held the door open for Foxy to get back in. She and Zip left, and Keefe got back in his car. They headed to Club 662. According to Keefe, he wanted to confront Suge and ask him why he jumped his nephew. Of course, he had a Glock on him, so I doubt it was going to be an amicable conversation, but it may have just been brought for backup initially. But we know the rest of the story. Keefe's account of that fateful night. Keefe claimed he actually saw Suge the night before the fight. Suge had pulled up in a Rolls Royce. They greeted each other and everything. Not one word was said about any potential beef he had with him. Instead, they jumped Baby Lane out of nowhere. Everyone in Keefe's crew had been shot at least once, so they were hardened, stone-cold killers, he said. They waited for an hour and a half in the parking lot of Club 662, a club owned by Suge. Tired of waiting, they left. They decided to carry on with their weekend and revisit the situation at a later date. Some of the people in Keefe's car were talking about the police possibly targeting them, and they were convinced Suge had cops working for him. Keefe wasn't comfortable with that sort of talk, so jumped out of the car and joined his nephew in the white Cadillac. One guy named Bubble Up was driving. Baby Lane and Freaky were in the back. They all drove off, and the white Cadillac that Keefe was in beat the lights. The other two vehicles were caught at the lights. As they were driving, they heard the fans calling out to Tupac and saw him hanging out of the window, calling back to them. According to Keefe, if Park had not been hanging out of the window, they would have never seen him. They busted a U and slowly went by each vehicle until they found the one they were looking for. They approached the black car that Tupac was in. Keefe and Suge caught eyes. He looked as though he was thinking, not these guys. Keefe claims Tupac reached down beneath his seat in what Keefe described as an erratic move. He said he could actually understand why police officers shout for suspects to put their hands where they can see them. In a Vlad TV interview, he was asked how he saw Park reaching if he was approaching the car from behind, but he claimed that's what he saw. He insists Tupac pulled out a strap, and so the shooting began. Suge, he was the first to get shot.
I grabbed Pac, I pulled him down. I got shot in the head with I still got 45 bullets and inches to my skull.
Meanwhile, Keefe ducked as low as he could. When the shooting stopped, they fled. Keefe claims some female fans in a car behind began to follow them, but their car was shot at, so they stopped following. According to Keefe, no one in Suge's entourage in the cars that followed behind him did anything. There were some death row bodyguards in the other cars. He maintains that the police should have checked Tupac's hands for gunshot residue. But wouldn't they have found a gun on Park if he was shooting back? Where would Suge or Tupac have had time to hide a gun before the police got to them? 2 Vegas bike cops were on the scene almost immediately. Meanwhile, Suge did a U-turn and drove down the strip. Maybe he was in shock, or he was trying to get Park to a hospital, or just trying to flee to safety. The car involved in the shooting was abandoned, and the perpetrators fled on foot. They had to cross the street. As they were crossing, 2 ambulances sped by, one transporting Tupac, the other Suge. Tupac passed away 6 days later. Keefe said the moral of the story is that gangster life is nothing to mess with. Some gangster rappers glorify the life that he has led, and as a result, have a lot of people's minds twisted. Quote, "The truth of the matter is, gangbanging and acting like a thug ain't no joke. These street wars taking place in urban communities around the country are as real as the war that US troops engage in around the world. In some cases, the streets' body counts are even higher." End quote. He said it was no more than another day at the office, and the killing of Tupac and the shooting of Suge was nothing more than collateral damage. He said he does have some remorse for what happened to Tupac. He was greatly talented and had tons of potential that he didn't get to fulfill as his life was cut short. Keffe said he was sorry that his family, friends and fans, and especially his mother, had to go through the pain of losing Pac. But he stands firm in believing that Tupac, Suge and his crew had no business putting their hands on his beloved nephew, Baby Lane. For those in his world, it was a green light to do what they did. He said Suge knew better and should have protected Tupac. Tupac's killing did ultimately lead to the demise of the Southside Crips. It shone a light on them and put them on the radar of law enforcement. Their operations were never successful again, and ultimately, many of them ended up in jail. Keffe revealed, after they had shot Tupac, they went back to the hotel and continued partying like it was any other night. They even poured out a little liquor for him. When they got back to Compton, they said nothing to no one. They took the car to be detailed and returned it to the rental. All the forensics were gone. Suge was the first to name Keefe D in an interview, and it was published in a news article. Even on the news, Orlando was referred to as Keefe D's nephew. He believed only Suge could have been the one to put his name out there. Because of his affiliation with the Tupac killing, Keffe's associates left and wanted nothing to do with him and his business. Suge even left town to lay low. The Southside Crips were staking his house. Leaving town probably saved his life. Plus, he had a girlfriend and his kids living with him, so he had a family to protect. They even tried to get him at the Death Row Studios, but he was nowhere to be found. This led to the downfall of Death Row Records. Many of them were left with no projects and no pay. Puffy called Zip and asked if they were involved. Keffe never said a word. Keffe did manage to avoid jail for a while, despite many of his homies getting raided and arrested. He was warned in advance about the raids and he managed to leave the neighbourhood, and I suppose he hid the evidence, telling his story and snitching. He soon became known as one of the leaders of the Southside Crips and was followed by the feds 24/7. Suge had violated his parole by fighting in Vegas, but the Compton Police Captain Reggie Wright Sr. and Compton Police Sergeant Reynolds got Orlando to make a deal on behalf of Suge, allegedly. If Orlando said that Suge was actually trying to help him, not beat him up, they would pay him $60,000. Suge allegedly had corrupt police officers working for him at death row. These officers didn't know if they wanted to enforce the law or be gangbangers. Orlando agreed to take the money and testified on Suge's behalf in court, but the judge ruled against Suge anyway. Remember, Tupac was also out on bail, awaiting his appeal for his sexual assault conviction, yet he was caught on camera fighting gang members. Perhaps he too would have ended up back in prison for violating a condition of his bail. He had every reason to lay low and avoid trouble, but he was quick to react instead of weigh up the consequences. Suge was the same and he paid the price for it. Sadly, Tupac paid with his life, and Suge is probably going to spend the rest of his life in prison. Things calmed down between Death Row and the Crips soon after Vegas, but the corrupt police officers who allegedly worked for Death Row were literally licensed to kill, and it was believed they fulfilled hits out on people on behalf of Suge. Keffe believes Bad Boy were on their list, and it was this that led to the killing of Biggie Smalls. Puffy eventually came face to face with Keffe after the Tupac killing, and the night before Biggie Smalls was killed, they met at the House of Blues in LA, Sunset Boulevard, at a posthumous album release party for Eazy-E. Biggie and Puffy were promoting Biggie's new album, Life After Death. This was a fatal mistake, as it was just 6 months after Tupac's murder. Puffy was nervous to approach Keffe because they all had guns on them. Things were very tense in the neighbourhood at the time. They were all strapped for protection, as at least 5 more gang members had been killed. Puffy went up to them and told them his plans for the weekend, telling them all their movements in advance. Not very wise. They all partied together. Puffy and Biggie sat on thrones and drank Cristal. He had come a long way from the early days as a struggling up-and-coming record executive. That night, news got around that the Bloods were in the area and the FBI was there. Puffy warned Keffe that the FBI were following him around. He decided to leave and left some Dom Perignon and Cristal for Keffe and his crew to continue partying with. Keffe told him to be careful as the Bloods were out there. Even at the party, he had seen some women from death row. Puffy probably had a false sense of security because the FBI were following him around. He probably thought they'll protect him and that the Bloods wouldn't come anywhere near him. On the 8th of March 1997, after attending an awards show, Biggie and Puffy attended a party that had many other big names there. Janet Jackson, Aaliyah, Belle Biv DeVoe, and various athletes, for instance, were in attendance. Life on the Strip was popping. Biggie Smalls, aka Christopher Wallace. The venue became overcrowded and the fire marshals shut the party down in the early hours of the morning. People had to vacate the building. Keffe and his crew left and went outside to wait for their cars to be returned by the valets. Biggie approached them and told them where they were going next. Keffe said he and his friends would come through. Puffy came up to them and invited them to a barbecue at Aaron Spelling's house the following day too. Biggie pulled off first and Puff followed behind him. A few minutes later, someone ran up shouting, "They shot Biggie, they shot Biggie." Rumours started going around that not only were the Southside Crips responsible for Tupac's death, they were also responsible for the killing of Biggie, as payback for not getting paid by Puffy. This is also what the cops believed, or at least what they were putting out there. In the early hours of the morning on the 9th of March, Biggie was in his SUV, stopped at a red light, on the corner of Wiltshire Boulevard and South Fairfax Avenue. Just 50 yards from the museum, a dark-coloured 94 to 96 Chevrolet Impala pulled up alongside Wallace's SUV. The driver rolled down the window and began shooting. He was shot 4 times. It was the 4th bullet that proved fatal, striking several vital organs. Keefe denied that he or any of the Southside Crips were responsible for Biggie. They were cool with Biggie and hung out with him. They hadn't been paid, true, but they had nothing against Biggie. He said it was the crooked Compton cops, who worked for Suge, who had one foot in law enforcement and the other in the gang world, who started the rumours about the Southside to deflect from what they did. Kefe's car was even raided because it was a dark-coloured Impala similar to the one used in Biggie's killing. Keffe did have a car that matched the description, but he rarely drove it. After forensic testing, the car was ruled out as the one used. The FBI did many raids of members affiliated with Keffe. His phone was tapped and he was caught making a call arranging a transaction with one of his associates. It was a 7-second call filled with code words. Not once were drugs mentioned, but this would be the call to land him back in jail. Although he used code words, the call was still incriminating and considered to be proof of his involvement in drug trafficking. He ended up getting arrested in front of his kids, wife and mother-in-law. He found out that a few of his homeboys had snitched on him. When some of the officers saw this short guy, they were shocked that this was the leader of the Southside Crips. Sadly, while in jail the following morning, he was informed by a chaplain that his grandmother had passed away. Shockingly, on the same day, the same chaplain returned to tell him more bad news. He informed him that his nephew, Orlando Anderson, was killed the same day, May the 29th, 1998. His grandmother died at 4 a.m. and Baby Lane approximately 12 hours later. Baby Lane was killed along with 2 others at Rob's Car Wash in Compton. A shootout took place. His truck was shot at multiple times. One of his homies, the Reaper as he was called, was there. As they drove off, Orlando said he couldn't feel his legs and passed away right there. Keffe's request to attend both funerals was denied. He finally ended up getting 71 months in prison. His co-defendant received 60 months. He went to the federal pen in Stafford, Arizona. Some FBI agents came to see him and started grilling him about the Tupac killing. They threatened to send him to a maximum security prison, which would have been much more restrictive. Instead, he was locked up with billionaires and key players in government. He realised he was not as big time as he thought. He spent 5.5 years in prison. While he was there, he never heard from Puffy. He didn't help him out once. Not even some Sean Jean underwear. He basically came to him when he was terrified of having bloods on his case. But when things went down, he was nowhere to be found. Out of jail, snitching to stay out. The FBI kept trying to contact him, but he tried to evade them. He even heard from movie executives telling him they wanted to make movies about Tupac and Biggie. He finally agreed to talk to them. They revealed that he had been on surveillance for 2 years. They had a lot on him that could put him away for the rest of his life. They claimed they had him linked to a couple of murders, but also acknowledged that he didn't kill anybody. He was able to read between the lines. His wife and kids urged him to cooperate. He didn't want to cooperate with the police, but every single member of his family told him to do so. In the end, he agreed. All his homeboys had snitched on him, and there was a lot of video evidence. There was no way he was going to get out of this without doing some lengthy prison time. There was footage of him selling kilos of drugs. None of his homeboys warned him. They knew they were setting him up. He was the main person of interest in both the Biggie and Tupac murders too. The guy in the car with Baby Lane, the Reaper, snitched on him too. He allegedly told the cops that Keefe had sold kilos to him. They all turned on him one by one. He felt betrayed and close to tears at finding out that those who were like brothers to him turned on him and set him up to save themselves. Victor, the kid involved in the death row chain incident, ended up getting killed while hanging out with his friend Tucker, who attended Pepperdine University. Tucker eventually ended up snitching, according to Keefe. Even his daughter's boyfriend, who was like a son to him, set him up. His own family members snitched. He felt he had no choice but to cooperate with the feds.
And they offered me a deal I couldn't refuse. They was gonna put my family on the street, take my house, my freedom. They was gonna rape me. You know what I'm saying?
Plus, most of the people he would implicate were already dead. Some rules dictate it's not snitching if the people snitched on are dead, while others consider it snitching regardless. The feds were on his case, as Biggie Smalls' mother had taken the LAPD to court over her son's murder. For years, she has maintained that crooked LAPD cops had something to do with it. Keefe's deal was that if he told the cops everything he knows about the Tupac and Biggie murders, nothing he revealed would be used against him. They were more concerned about Biggie's murder. They wanted to get out of the lawsuit. The cops were convinced the Southside Crips killed him in retaliation for not getting paid by Puffy. The cops kept their word. They even let a few of the people connected to Keefe go. He said he never felt right after he cooperated. It seems he felt more guilty about cooperating with the feds than the killing of Tupac. But who knows? He stopped selling dope completely and said goodbye to the world he had known his whole life. His meetings with the cops were recorded. These recordings have been revealed over the years. One cop used the recordings to make money, writing books and participating in documentaries about the killing of Tupac. There was even a Netflix series. The infamous Keefe D tapes were revealed in one such documentary. LAPD detective Greg Kadin wrote the book Murder Rap, The Untold Story of the Biggie Smalls and Tupac Shakur Murder. Keefe said profiting off what should have been private tapes was definitely unethical and should be illegal. Rogue cops can publish confidential information with impunity. That's some BS, he said. One of the reasons murders in the black communities go unsolved is people are afraid to come forward for fear they will be found out and killed for snitching. Releasing these tapes does nothing to instill confidence in their ability to protect people who come forward with information. Keefe snitched because they offered him a deal he couldn't refuse. He maintains that the main person he snitched on was himself. He said that no one went to prison for what he revealed. Keefe was not a rapper, but he was involved in some key moments of hip-hop history. He represents what happens when hip-hop and street life collide. Although he made more money than most make in a lifetime, from a very young age, although he gained the respect of those in his hood and on the streets of Compton and all over, he paid too great a price to say it was all worth it. He spent half his life in jail, and many of those close to him are now dead. Do you think Keefe D's accounts of Tupac and Biggie's killings are accurate? Do you consider Tupac's killing a solved case now. And how did you feel about hearing Keefe D's story and the part that he had to play in the killing of Tupac Shakur? For resources on rehabilitation for former gang members, please check out the description box below. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts below, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and don't forget to click the bell for more.